luggage was lost because of all these logistical things they're facing, so we can't find your luggage. So we stayed about in an hour line there. And I told some of you this too, I think at Bible study, but sometimes you wonder why the Lord seems to put so many barricades up. I was thinking about that a lot. You think that this is a good thing to go down here and help these saints? Why does it seem that there's so many boundaries he's setting up here? And then at least partly the reason became clear to us why this all had to happen and we needed to lose our luggage, because we had to stand in a line in Mexico City because it was there that a Muslim asked Reverend Marcus and me many questions. And we were given opportunity to witness to this individual, and that made all the delays totally worth it. I think of that Bible passage where it says, Jesus must needs pass through Samaria because he has to talk to that Samaritan woman at the well. This is somewhat different, but we must needs pass through Mexico City. You might wonder, when did you get your clothes back? This is Tuesday, not until Friday. So we went to Pastor Sergio brought us from Axla to a city about an hour and a half away called Bias, and we were able to pick up our clothes there. So we're just hoping they invite us back because we weren't sure how we were smelling by the time Friday came around. Pick up from the airport. So we went from Mexico City and we landed in Tampico, and there Pastor Sergio and a young man from Huacatlan, the mission, picked us up and took us in his little Jetta. I'll show you a picture of that in a moment. But he and Reverend Marcus and I and this boy went, and one of our first stops was in Tampico yet, and we stopped at a bank. But before we got there, Pastor Sergio crashed into someone else. We got into a fender bender, and he and the guy just talked, and they kind of figured things out. They're speaking in Spanish, and Pastor Sergio told us later, he said, that guy had tinted windows, and just the feel of things, he said he may have been part of the mafia. And if it was just you two, Barnhill and Marcus, you could have been in serious trouble. So, again, the Lord's preserving work there. After our fender bender, we came to this bank and sat in these seats. And another interesting experience here, Reverend Marcus and I are sitting in the seats, and Pastor Sergio is standing over here talking to a man neither of us recognized. I leaned over to Reverend Marcus and I said, do you know that guy Pastor is talking to? Never seen him before. Turns out, this is just a random guy on the street who saw two Americans with Pastor Sergio. Sergio said, a lot of these people, when they see Americans, see dollar signs. And he went up to Sergio and he said, I can give you a better exchange rate, dollars to pesos, than the bank can give you. Sergio obviously wasn't going to buy into that, and a bank employee even came over and, is everything okay? And yeah, you don't deal with these sort of people off the street. So that was pretty interesting. We're about an hour into our delegation trip and pretty concerned about things. This is a picture of Pastor Sergio's little Jetta, just a reliable car. But we had to get from Tampico to Axel, which I said is about a 3-hour drive. Pastor Sergio makes it about 2. And it was a white-knuckle experience, and I'm not exaggerating. He was passing people over a double yellow lines, and we had semi-trucks coming, and it probably must not have been much more than 100 yards, and he would quick dart into his lane again. I'm just holding on to the bars of the seat for dear life, and I'm looking at this kid sitting next to me, and he kind of looks at me like, well, this is normal. So that was quite the experience too. And I joked with Pastor Sergio a lot about that. So we got into Axla to the name of our hostess. Her name is Sister Ines. Sister Ines lives right in the city of Axla. I'll show you a picture of us walking through the town so you can get a little bit of a feel for that. This is a picture of Sister Ines's yard. So you don't have, your clean-cut, trimmed, grassy yard. There are roosters out here, and at least one dog. And one of her sons raises roosters to fight other roosters, which I don't think is legal in the United States. But these roosters would make quite the choir in the morning. And these homes, I'll point that out to you later, the homes are pretty open so you can hear everything. I realize this video just doesn't do it justice, but gives you a little idea of the sounds we were hearing. So you knew when it was about 4 or 5 a.m. and you needed to get up because the roosters were up. And peddlers coming in the street too, and just coming right into your front yard and shouting into your home, trying to sell items. So just a very busy atmosphere. One of the things that maybe I wasn't expecting was how fruity and tropical this area was. This is very typical of Axla and the surrounding areas, that you have a lot of fruit trees, and we were able to drink a lot of freshly squeezed fruits. By the way, this is at someone in the congregation's house, so this is right on their property. There's a parrot in this cage, and of course, he speaks Spanish. This is just a little sample of what Axla looks like. Very typical road here. And just a little bit of the sights and sounds. So our house would be, right in the middle, sandwiched between buildings like this. So you're definitely not out in the country where we were. Talk a little bit about the church here. The church's name, like I said, is Emmanuel. Now, when we pulled up, you children may notice with interest dogs standing on the roof of the church and barking at us when we came into the church parking lot. The parsonage is not right on top of the church, but it's a little bit back. But it's sort of built on a hill. And so these are the pastor's dogs, and they just kind of have free reign on the church roof. The building itself has been around for roughly 40 years. As far as the people worshiping in it and the sort of leadership that they've had, Pastor Sergio has not been the pastor of this church for all those 40 years. At its beginnings, and through a lot of its years, it was Baptist. Pastor Sergio, in the last years he's been pastor of Emmanuel, has sought to turn the direction more to Reformed, and we'll get to that more as well later. So we're very thankful for the work that Pastor Sergio is doing. Middle is Pastor Sergio, and here are his two deacons. There are no elders in the church. I'll get to that in a moment. I want to talk to you a little bit about Pastor Sergio. He attended a Baptist seminary for his own theological education. After he left that seminary, he began to preach in Axla, some of these details are not so clear to me. Presumably it's in a manual that he began preaching. While preaching in Axla, he also taught at a Baptist seminary. Sort of sounds like this is a volunteer basis kind of thing. And he would teach at this Baptist seminary. Well, he began to get asked questions by his seminary students about things like predestination and saving calling. And he started to come around to realize that what he had learned in seminary was not quite correct. He began studying and seeing what the scriptures teach, became more and more of a reformed conviction about predestination and calling, and he began to teach these things to the students. So the seminary said, you're out of here if you're going to be teaching this sort of stuff. So he basically gets kicked out of that seminary where he was teaching on a volunteer basis. And very sadly, in those churches, they have conventions. You might be familiar, for example, with the Southern Baptist Convention, sort of like a denomination. The men in his convention, many of them anyway, are Arminian, and they really want nothing to do with Pastor Sergio either. That makes it very real, doesn't it? A man wants to teach the Reformed truth, stands for that conviction, but it means that a lot of his colleagues want nothing to do with him. So I think that makes it real for us how much someone gives up for the sake of the gospel, by the grace of God. He's studying. He's kicked out of seminary, but he's studying Reformed truth. In the course of his studies, he comes across Spanish resources on the Covenant Protestant Reformed Church website. That's where Reverend Stewart preaches in Ballymena, Northern Ireland. You should look that up sometime on their website. They've got a whole list of Spanish resources. So Pastor Sergio read those with great interest. He contacted Reverend Stewart. Reverend Stewart pointed him to First PRC in Grand Rapids because, as you know, they've been sending men down to Mexico in the last years. So Pastor Sergio got in touch with First GR, and then First GR said, I think this is an FMC thing. We have our own work in Mexico. FMC can have this contact, which is distinct from what we're doing. So First GR and an FMC a few months ago, I think it was September or something, had a Zoom meeting together, and we began communicating with Pastor Sergio, and a gentleman by the name of Donner Bartolome was instrumental. He was kind of the in-between for the FMC and Pastor Sergio, and he really helped us get to know this contact. So we got something set up to visit Pastor Sergio, and the rest is history. That's a little bit of history of him and how we came to know him. As far as Pastor Sergio himself is concerned, it's hard to know someone unless you're really there with them. Hard to know them through a picture too. This is a really fun, loving, very humorous individual. And Reverend Marcus and I thought that his just gentle, fun-loving way, even he'd crack jokes sometimes, we felt that that really helped him have a good rapport with his congregation. And from every indication, he had an excellent relationship with the people. So just a really kind, godly man. And I say something about his zeal for the ministry. We're going to talk about Awakatlan in a moment, the mission of this church. It's roughly an hour away. He makes that trip, I think he said 8 times a month. Just all over the place, going to people's homes, preaches on Sunday. Very encouraging to see his zeal and the strength that the Lord has given to him. These are his 2 deacons. Like I said, they're no elders. Pastor Sergio will be the first one to tell you that they should have elders. He recognizes the inadequacy of not having them. He doesn't feel that these men are ready for that. Godly men They're learning. They're zealous for the Reformed faith, but he doesn't quite feel that they're ready for the eldership yet. So they do the work of deacons. They don't have any elders quite yet. And that just makes you so thankful for what the Lord has given us here too. You don't even question. Of course you have office bearers, the full set, but not everyone can take that for granted. This is the mission, Awakaklan de Jesus. So here's Axla. I don't know if this is the route we took, but when I plugged it into Google, that's what it gave me. So you're looking at about an hour drive to the southwest. And this is a very, maybe you can pick up on a little bit here. You're going up pretty high into the mountains. So when you combine Pastor Sergio's Jetta and his fast driving and winding mountain roads, if you get sick as a passenger, you definitely get sick on a drive like this. But just a beautiful drive and huge mountains too. Give you a little bit of history about Awakaklan mission. Began about 8 years ago, and the way that it began was Pastor Sergio handed out gifts from an organization called Samaritan's Purse. While he was handing out these gifts, he would testify to the gospel of grace to people. And the Lord made it that a little mission group began. He had a few families. Initially, so this around 8 years ago, in the subsequent years, he entrusted the work to one of those deacons that you saw. And they began with 10 families. They met in a house in Awakaklan. A few months ago, the work was entrusted to an American who came down to Mexico as a missionary. His name is John Cook, and I'll tell you more about him in a little bit. Currently, they're under John Cook, and the group meets in this building. It's a rented building. It doesn't have anything up here. It's kind of a stairway to nowhere, but they're hoping if they can advance that they can maybe make an area up there that they can worship in. But you're down here in this building and you go through a door there. Currently, and sadly, only 3 or 4 families remain in the mission. A lot of them left, Pastor Sergio said, because they're just not convicted of the Reformed truth. This is inside that building of the mission, and people sit down in their chairs, and you got a little area there where you can speak and so on. Now I want to expand a little bit on John Cook. He's this guy, second to last on the left. Here's a picture of the group and Reverend Marcus and I. John Cook was sent into Mexico by 2 churches in South Carolina. Those 2 churches, I understand, are both probably Southern Baptist. One has a more Baptist leaning, another has a more Reformed Baptist leaning. But those 2 churches sent John Cook to Mexico. Sounds like kind of an open-ended deal. You find somewhere to labor. And John Cook is looking different places, and he's unimpressed with all the Arminianism that he's discovering in churches and pastors. Then he comes upon Pastor Sergio, an exception to Arminianism, staunchly Reformed, convicted on that, very attracted to that, and John Cook says, this is the man I want to work with and be associated with. So the way it happens is Pastor Sergio and Cook work closely together. Sergio is more in Axla. John Cook is more in Awakaklan, but they do go to each other's places quite frequently as well. So currently he is here. He has a wife and 3 children, and when we came there and we're talking to them, he said, "You wouldn't believe how long it's been since I've talked English to somebody." You kids think of that. Living in a land that's totally foreign to you. And we thank the Lord for the way that some of these people are willing to lay down their lives in significant ways that the gospel might go forth. Pastor Sergio and John Cook are both committed to outreach. So even though there is the congregation in Axtla and there is a Wakaklen, they're both committed to seeking to send the gospel to as many local areas as they can. This is not on Sunday. I want to say this was Wednesday maybe. So we would give speeches through the week. I'll get to that in a moment. And often there would be singing, and I want to give you a little sample, 1 out of 2, of their singing. And this is their songbook. I'll have another video, but in Axtla of that happening. As far as the work is concerned, Reverend Marcus did his own speeches and sermons in Spanish. Each of us had a couple of speeches, and each of us had one sermon. But when I would do it, I would stand here, and he would stand to the side, and we kind of worked it out together before we even left. I had an English paragraph, and then he and Reverend Marcus's sister, who helped him, translated it into Spanish. He could probably do it on the spot too. It's just more fluid this way. So I would give a little paragraph in English, and they wouldn't have any idea what I was saying, and then Reverend Marcus would translate it into Spanish, and then you'd see some recognition on their faces and so on. We gave speeches related to the doctrine of the church and to witnessing, which were areas they were looking for.
Voy a leer primero de 1 Corintios 12, versículo 12 a 20. Primero de Corintios 12, versículo 12 a 20. Porque así como...
There were, Reverend Marcus did it very capably. There were a couple times, which is very understandable, where he just couldn't think of a word during a speech or a sermon, and they could see he was struggling, and someone would just shout out the words. So, that happens, but I'll talk more about Reverend Marcus in a moment. This is outside the mission. This gives you a little bit of a taste. So we've just left the building. We're looking over a wall here, and it hardly does justice, but just quite something. And you are right in the clouds up there, so that's another feature of that. One of the big things that we did when we were there was we went into people's homes. It must have been 10 plus families to get to know the people, get a feel for the way of life. This might sound humorous at first, but it is important to eat their food because that's a big bridge between you and them. When they can see you enjoying their culture, that's a big thing. This was a very common meal. This was at a lady's house and other people for breakfast. And these are homemade tortillas. And I'm going to give you a little sampling of how they would do those.
Sí. Son los, como los aquí luego se me olvida. Tiene una forma, los artistas pues que se encargan de hacer eso son indígenas en su mayoría. Tienen mucha creatividad. Aquí le decimos tuya, pero es creativa. Tres nacionalidades.
You kind of dip it in those sauces and kind of a glazed enchilada. Here is the tasty but infamous pizza. Because Americans were here, we're in Sister Inez's house right here. Here are a couple of her sons. I think this is the wife of him. And here's Pastor Sergio. And her boys got together and they said, well, if you guys are in Mexico, why don't we get you pizza one night? And so they said, we'll get you soda too. And they did. The problem is, Pastor Sergio told us later that he saw a little bit of unmelted cheese in the middle. And maybe there was some salmonella in there. Reverend Marcus and I were pretty sick the next day. And we think it was the pizza, of all things, in Mexico. He was able to give his speech the next night. I told him, go without me, I'm just going to stay in bed. And so that wasn't very nice, but 24 hours or so on, and you sort of get over it or act like you have. And when you go into people's homes, they don't hold back. They give you food and food and food. I told Reverend Marcus the next day, I can't have this. You have to tell them that. I'm sick to my stomach. But you really can't, because you're going to be rude. And so they just stick it in front of you. It was so good, but you just get it down when you don't really feel good. Here, we're out for coffee in a cafe with a gentleman from the congregation. He owns that little cafe, so you'll find quite a few of these kind of little nooks in the city. So this would be, I was showing you the lady that made it. I don't know if this was her dish or not, but this would be very typical, at least for when we were there and ate breakfast. Black beans, looks kind of gross on the picture, but very good. A cut of beef, and there you have your enchiladas and that sauce on there, homemade tortillas and some crumbled cheese. Very, very good. This would be a sampling of a person's house there. They're, of course, all going to be a little bit different, but notice how open they are. There was a lot of the homes like that, because usually you're in the 70s, 80s, 90s, even hundreds there, and so people don't have air conditioning. They're going to have their homes ventilated to stay cool. But when we were there, I think when I left Sioux Falls, it was that week where it was -20 and -40 wind chills. I think that had dipped so low that it was 40s at night, 50s, 60s in the day here. These people, that's why you see them. They're walking around with coats. That is not normal. But, when we went there, you're almost ready to lie on the beach because it's so warm compared to what you came from. So they were plenty shocked when they saw us at times in short sleeves. But yeah, the people were cold. This would be another family that we visited, another sampling of a visit in the home and having breakfast. People very gracious. Another example, there's Pastor Sergio taking a selfie and including us. There's a picture of a family we were with. This right here is called tamarind. Has anyone ever heard of tamarind before? It's very sugary, and you can kind of break it up. You can cook it. You can eat it raw too. And they gave me a bag. Reverend Marcus was really excited about it. He grew up in Mexico. He knew what tamarind was, and probably somewhat sentimental for him. And I just gave him my bag. But he did, I think, give it to some kids at Peace, and he said they didn't really care for it. Now, this is a very moving experience that we went through. Donor Bartolone, the man that was kind of the go-between for Pastor Sergio and the FMC, he works with the children in Axtla, helping them with catechism. And they have the Westminster Shorter Catechism, it's called. We have the Heidelberg Catechism, Belgic Confession, Canons of Dort. In the Presbyterian tradition, you have the Westminster Standards, and a part of that is the Westminster Shorter Catechism, especially useful for children. Donor kind of teaches the kids, probably over Zoom or something, and in person when he can, but Donor has a special program if you're up for it. The special program, the kids don't really find this interesting, is to memorize the Westminster Shorter Catechism in English. These kids don't know English. They don't learn English in school. It's a totally foreign language. That would be like taking your beginner's or junior's book in catechism, let's say the first 10 or 15 lessons, memorizing all those answers together in Spanish when you've never learned Spanish in your life. I think there were multiple children a part of this, and at the end there were just 3 because it's so hard. 2 teenagers, both of them Pastor Sergio's daughters, and 1 8-year-old girl, 8 years old, and they were expected to know about a third of the Westminster Shorter Catechism in English. And so whenever you kids get tired of memorizing catechism, I'll just remind you of that, okay, so that you're encouraged to keep on going. They do have 1 catechism class on the Westminster Shorter Catechism for children 10 and younger, and then for children older than that, they actually stay in church and they, with the congregation, learn the Westminster Shorter Catechism, 1 question and answer per Sunday. So he puts it right up on the screen, and the leader and the congregation just echo it back and forth until they basically memorized it. Here's that 8-year-old girl getting examined. Just a few seconds of that.
More gods than one?
There is but one only, the living and true God.
How many persons? How many persons are there in the Godhead?
There are 3 persons in the Godhead, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, and these 3 are one God in the same substance, equal in power and glory.
Nice. What are the decrees of God?
The decrees of God are His eternal purpose, according to the consent of His will, whereby for His own glory He hath foreordained whatsoever come to pass.
If we did nothing else on this trip, but only that would have made it worth it. That was beautiful. To see from the lips of babes and sucklings the confession of truth in a language we could understand. And again, doesn't that make us so thankful for a catechism program? This is after the exam, so these are Pastor Sergio's 2 teenage daughters. And this is that little 8-year-old girl. Reverend Marcus and I pooled our resources together to give them a few American $1 bills and a little bit of candy. And they thrilled to get those little presents. Here's part of the Emmanuel congregation gathered together after one of the speeches. This is very common. We'd have sweets. They had sweet bread bought, but we had that a lot. Just kind of sugary, floury, tasty bread and some cookies and coffee. They also had this white drink. It was kind of cinnamon, and it had cornstarch in it. And that tasted good at the beginning of the trip, but after you get sick, that's the last thing you want to see. But that's also something that people drank. On Saturday evening, we had side ribs over some charcoal, and they put some onions in here, and they slathered that steak a little bit. Some of the best meat I've ever had. It was really, really good. I want to just say a little bit about their worship. Here we are inside Emmanuel in Axla. The services consist of prayer and singing, offerings, reciting the Westminster Shorter Catechism, and preaching. Preaching is the main thing there. John Cook and Pastor Sergio said, don't worry about going too long because the people are used to going long. Their sermons would be at least an hour in length. So they do see the preaching as central, as is proper. Their songbook is a mixture of psalms and non-Armenian hymns. I make a point of that because Pastor Sergio said I went through this hymn book and psalms and I rooted it out of all the Arminianism in there. So that was pretty neat to hear. You'll notice that they don't have an organ and piano, obviously. They have different instruments, guitar, and I'll show you a video, but this guy's sitting on a kind of box thing, and that's a drum, and you may have seen that in the other video too. So I'll show that in a little bit. As far as their preaching and doctrine, like I said, preaching is central to the services. They are Reformed in doctrine. Would they agree with us on every single detail? No. But, things like infant baptism and certain things on the end times and how we think through that. They told us repeatedly, you men show us from the scriptures something like infant baptism, and we'll look at the scriptures, and you be patient with us, and we'll see what the Word of God says. Isn't that a beautiful way to dialogue? And that just shows you the humility of Pastor Sergio and John Cook. And they're eager to learn, and we're eager to learn from them too. The people do find some doctrines hard to understand, but I suppose you could get that in any church, but they are eager. And when you'd see them as you're speaking, and when Reverend Marcus was speaking, you see head nods and excitement for the gospel. Here's a sample of a worship. Wonderful to sing with them. I usually didn't know what they were singing, but here you recognize that tune. And as they were singing, I thought, this is great to sing It Is Well With My Soul with saints from Mexico. But unfortunately, that's not what they were singing. That's the tune, but it's different words. So you do find that some tunes we're familiar with, but they're different words. Here we are with Pastor Sergio. Just a few concluding thoughts, and then we'll sing and pray. Remember to pray for these of God's people in this faraway land of the world, and so we can keep our prayers about the Catholic Church specific in this area. Pray that the Lord would give us an open door here. What that would look like, I don't know. What direction the Foreign Mission Committee wants to go, I don't know. We haven't even met yet. That's Tuesday. But if it's the Lord's will that somehow we become involved here, that would be wonderful, and certainly something that maybe we could pray for. Thankful for the opportunity to travel here and enjoy communion with brothers and sisters in the Lord. I have a translator app on my phone. That's how I communicated with these people. And one of the ladies there was thanking us for coming. And I said to her, and I'll share it with you, wherever you are with God's people, you are with family. That's the wonderful thing about a trip like this. We personally found it to be richly profitable, and multiple people said, when will you come back? We want you to come back. So thankful for that too. Before I end, just something about Reverend Marcus. He did all that translating for not only the sermons, but the speeches. But you have to remember, he's talking to these people all the time and fielding probably 300 questions I had for Pastor Sergio. And they come from me through Reverend Marcus to Pastor Sergio, and Pastor Sergio's things come from Reverend Marcus to me. I don't know how Reverend Marcus didn't go to bed every night without a big migraine. He had a lot of work. And so thankful for his place in our churches, and that the Lord gives him a specific skill set to use in Zion for something like this. Let's sing. Psalter number 49. And we'll sing all three stanzas. Before we close, and I don't want to unnecessarily prolong, I know it's been long enough, but I do want to open it up just briefly. Does anyone have any questions? Any of you kids or any of the adults? Don't be shy. Don't need to, but if anyone does. Yes, Ed.
Above the manual church sign where the initials PIE, did you find out what that?
I don't. That may be a Spanish words. I think, don't quote me, I think the may have been Reformed Baptist. I think English and Spanish share the words. They sound not so dissimilar, I think. Anyone else? And thank you too to the Heritage congregation for allowing me to go. I know that's not always easy to have the pastor gone, especially when you have classical appointments, and I hope you get a little glimpse into what the Lord allowed us to do there. So there are refreshments in the back. We'll close in prayer. Our Father in heaven, we thank thee that thy gospel goes to the ends of the earth, gathering that thy saints are gathered by thy word and spirit. We pray that this presentation may have been instructional for us, but encouraging for us in our setting, and a means used by thee to spur us on to pray for thy church everywhere. Now bless us as we have fellowship among ourselves over food and drink. For Jesus' sake we pray. Amen.